Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Against TV. I'm your host, Arya Cohen-Wade, and joining me once again is Daniel Beskar. Could you please introduce yourself, Daniel?
Yeah, hi. My name's Daniel Bessner. I'm the co-host of a podcast that is new called American Prestige on international affairs and U.S. foreign policy. And I'm also a professor at the University of Washington, a contributing editor at Jacobin Magazine, and what else am I? I'm a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute.
So you're a busy guy, so thank you for taking the time to come on this show. You've been on a bunch of times now, so I think you're officially a friend of the show.
Friend of the pod.
Yeah, friend of the pod, and we'll send you that T-shirt that says "Friend of the Pod."
Yeah, hold on, that is a Pod Save America.
Yes,
thing,
yeah,
right?
I know. But so the last time we talked, it was shortly after the end of the Trump presidency, the beginning of the Biden presidency, and we talked about whether Trump would be should be seen, would be seen, is the worst president in American history. And we sort of batted that back and forth.
He's not even the worst president of the last 20 years.
Well, this question returned to the public sphere because a couple weeks ago, C-SPAN, the network, released its Presidential Historian Survey 2021. Apparently they've been doing this since the end of every presidency since 2000, I think, and we'll include the link to this really in-depth website that they put together where you can look at all the different ratings and compare people, and I don't know, it's almost like you seeing the stats and for MLB or something,
baseball players. Yeah.
So they've done four.
Oh yeah, that'd be fun. They should do like a president's baseball cards. Like, how many wars did you start? How many Americans did you kill? How many non-Americans did you kill? That would be a good little thing.
Yeah, I mean, and then the kids could trade them, and then they're probably worth something someday, and then maybe because in 50 years everyone would throw away their William Henry Harrison cards, that one would eventually be really valuable. And okay, so they've done 4 iterations of this starting in 2000, and then the newest one just came out. And so I thought it would be interesting to have you back on to talk about this. So let's see. So I mean, the headline. So they're ranking the presidents in terms of greatness. They queried it looks like at least 100 different historians of the American presidency, and like I said, they have all these they somehow derive these numbers down to the 10th decimal place, such that you could say Richard Nixon in the pursued equal justice for all category, he had a 42.8. So okay,
that's a meaningful number.
Yeah, so we have these facts now.
This whole thing is thing.
Well, let's just start with that. Yeah. So the last thing I'll say, I just want to read off what they list as who they list as the best presidents. 2021. Number 1, Lincoln. 2, Washington. 3, FDR. 4, Teddy Roosevelt. 5, Eisenhower. 6, Truman. 7, Thomas Jefferson. 8, John F. Kennedy. 9, Ronald Reagan. 10, Barack Hussein Obama. So that's the top 10.
Well, obviously recency bias for like 5 of those, and then founders and Lincoln. So kind of ridiculous, the whole thing. I mean, such a boomer list. Ridiculous that Kennedy is on there. What was he, 8 or 9, something like that? Like that just makes no sense.
Kennedy at 8.
Yeah. So I mean, the whole thing is an absurd exercise. That what is interesting though, and maybe a little bit off topic, is like, what's the obsession with ranking? Which has become like a thing in popular culture the last 20 years. I think especially Bill Simmons does a lot of rankings, and his websites, Grantland and The Ringer, are very successful. Yeah. So that's an interesting
BuzzFeed lists the 27 episodes of Friends you need to rewatch before whatever. So I mean, it's sort of a content.
It's a thing,
generation thing.
It's a content generation thing for sure. I mean, this is totally meaningless. Like, if the point of communication is to increase knowledge, at least in an ideal speech situation, this does nothing of that. No knowledge is increased. No one learns anything from this. You just learn kind of the biases of people who have the objective sheen of being, professionally trained experts, historians, but not
Okay,
much more
well,
than
then
that.
something is being learned, but maybe it's not what the people who put this thing together
Yeah,
intended
nothing about presidents is
it
being
to be
learned, right?
learned.
Because there's no, I mean, you cannot, if you wanted to do something like this, and you would have to like really define greatness very
Well,
coherently.
there are
Okay,
categories.
very
Okay, let me
coherently.
just read out the categories. So I believe that each of these each president was ranked by each historian on a numerical scale. I don't know if it's be 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 in each of these categories: public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management, moral authority, international relations, administrative skills, relations with Congress, vision slash setting an agenda, pursued equal justice for all, and performance within context of times. I believe that's 10 categories. And yes, that's how they derive these numbers, saying that George Washington has 873 or whatever, and that's how the ranking is generated. So they're
Yeah,
not just
great.
not just saying John Adams they didn't say take each
Right.
person,
But for all
historian,
of those,
and like rank them and and do like a ranked choice voting calculation.
right,
They're
right,
somehow saying that these are the important things, and
right.
then
But for all of those, what's the normative position, right? Like, what is good economic there's no normative baseline from which to actually make judgments.
Mhm.
So this is just random people giving random answers to random questions.
Well, they're not. I mean, they're not random. They're tenured professors.
What's good? What's good international relations?
So okay,
What's good economic management?
Right. Well,
What's
good economic management.
What's good leadership?
We could probably say, because that there's numbers,
Right.
and
So
there's growth of the economy.
are you going by GDP? Are you going? I mean, like, why go
Yeah,
by GDP?
I have no idea.
Is that a useful statistic? I have my doubts. American GDP is pretty good. The American economy for most people isn't great. So the whole thing is absurd. This is why it works for pop culture, right? When you're trying to figure out your favorite character of The Wire, then you could be like, yeah, Omar is cool, right? Omar always wins those, but it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
For something I mean, I guess this is all just fun, but to me, it's like, it's hard to be fun when like American presidents have been responsible for so much death and misery. But Americans don't care about that. So like, rank them, JFK's
Yes.
8.
Yes. Okay, so I've been sort of playing devil's advocate, but I also think this whole thing is pretty dumb, although maybe not quite as dumb as you think it is. And my initial thought when I saw this, well, let me just fill in a couple extra facts here. Okay, so they track over time. So, the views of historians change over time. Ulysses S. Grant rose from 33 to 20 in terms of ranking. And Andrew Jackson fell from 13 to 22. So we can there's obvious explanations for that, which is that Trump, viewed or supposedly viewed Jackson as his predecessor, and then the understanding of Grant's tenure in Reconstruction has been, there's been a revival in Grant.
Right. I think both of those I think are explained by like transformations in how people understand the history of race in the United States.
Right. And then the third
Jackson
one
will continue to fall.
The third one is Wilson.
Jackson.
Woodrow Wilson fell. He was 6 in the last one. Now he's 13. So that's sort of the same thing that elevated.
And he'll continue
Grant.
to fall too. Yeah.
Yeah. Even though certainly he did a lot. I mean, so it's and then the question is, what is great? Is actually the last episode I did was with the literary critic Christian Lorenzen, and we talked about
I like Christian.
The great American novel, and what does that mean? And so obviously greatness has no specific definition, and it's even hard to define a novel. And now we were talking about who is the great baby boomer American novelist, and it's hard to pin.
Novels like films. Yeah, I think with that, novels like films, they're just no longer the center of the culture anymore. So this is going to become an increasingly academic question. Like, novels are going the way of opera and jazz. So that's also, interesting. This is my big theory, that you and I in our lifetimes have witnessed the decline of mass entertainment. And I think that is really the major story. And you see that with the decline of film, the decline of the novel, the increasing relevance of real micro communities, the decline of mass culture as a whole. I mean, so like the greatness of an American novel, it almost doesn't matter because novels are just not at the center of culture and probably never will be again. But in theory, like, this is shaping how people understand politics. So it's more nefarious in a sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And the idea that they were able to get these things down to the 10th decimal point just sort of adds to the absurdity of being able to say
fetishization of numbers.
that
Right?
not only
Fetishization
you
of
give
numbers,
a 1 to 10 rank in something called moral authority, you could say it's 7.3, and that's it's sort of like Pitchfork. Pitchfork gives those
for almost all of those presidents, the answer would be very low
for moral
authority.
Well, hopefully, maybe at the end of the Biden 1 or 2 terms, you will be asked to participate in this process, and you can submit your thing full of goose eggs.
That is funny. I'm always asked to participate in like international relations polls that do similar things. I'm always like, like, should the United States, what should the military be? I'm like 0. I'm always the outlier for all those things. I mean, these things are all ridiculous. It just represents a fantasia about numbers being meaningful and things that they're not really meant to quantify. And that's very much a spirit of the age. And in 100 years, we'll look back on it and it'll all be ridiculous. And I implore listeners, watchers,
and viewers, yes.
And viewers to look at a book called Trust in Numbers by the great UCLA historian Theodore Porter. And he writes about why is it exactly that quantification has come to be fetishized in our particular society. And this stuff to me is really a representation of that trend, which is very bad. I think actually removes the human from things that are profoundly human and profoundly qualitative.
Okay, and you mentioned The Wire jokingly as ranking who's the best character on The Wire, and one of the themes of The Wire was the stats and juking the stats,
they're bullshit,
and so taking things that like downgrading crimes or and how they're classified so that the crime rate looks like it's getting better when it's really not, and then they took it into No Child Left Behind era. Middle school and the stats in terms of testing and stuff like that. So yeah, juking the stats is a big thing. You can say a test answer was correct or incorrect, whereas these things are totally, the whatever value is totally humanly assigned or something. But one other thing that interested me, is that, okay, so who is the best? Well, what do you think? Who is the best president in American history, if you had to pick one?
Probably Lincoln or FDR.
Okay, so
probably Lincoln or FDR. Yeah.
So they rank Lincoln 1. Also, they say Washington 2, FDR 3. So what I was thinking was this country is so insane, and there's so little agreement that even, when I was coming up, probably you only could have gotten mass agreement that Washington and Lincoln should have been 1 and 2. And then after that, it would have been a free-for-all. And so FDR 3, well, of course, the people who founded National Review would certainly not put him there. They would put him towards the bottom. And then, Eisenhower 5, that's sort of surprising.
That's ridiculous, by the way.
Kennedy was not a good president. So he's 8. So that's total sentimental.
Let me just go off on Eisenhower for a second. He literally institutionalized the national security state. Regardless of his final military industrial complex speech, the farewell address of, I believe, January 61, Eisenhower did a lot of very bad things, overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz, overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, I think in my own work helped inspire the failed East German uprising of 53 by promising things that weren't going to be there. Institutionalized the national security state, which I think is a very damaging thing. So it's really ridiculous that it's a very boomer answer. I would imagine the average age of this
I don't know where you would even put those things, and possibly within the ranking of greatness, those would be considered good things because the person accomplished something. So if we're saying international relations is 1/10 of the total ranking, then instigating foreign coups that didn't turn out so well only is a slight deduction. I guess that's how you get Eisenhower 5.
Great move. Iran to hate us forever.
Yeah. So, but if you I'm just thinking a conservative looking at this ranking, well, maybe they would put Reagan 1, and then Washington 2, and maybe Lincoln 3. But then, of course, I feel like there used to be more sort of anti-Lincoln stuff circulating in the air. But used to be, when I was 20 or so years ago, you would still see anti-Lincoln stuff. Lincoln's been, I don't know, seemingly even more deified since then, but they certainly wouldn't put Truman 6 and Obama 10. So it's just but really, what can everyone agree on? It's Lincoln and Washington. So there's been 40.
Well, historians are liberal. I mean, like, historians are centrist, center left. I would say, as a historian, I am on the outlier. Well, no, that's not true. It's different according to generation. People under 40 are more to the left, like everywhere else in the country. People over 40 are more centrist or to the right. And so that's why I would imagine the skewing of this age group would be slightly higher. It's just like a gigantic generational shift in our politics, and this will be reflected in things like this. I think that's probably a large explanation. The Lincoln thing's interesting. I would point people to Matt Karp's essay in Harper's, where he discusses this a little bit about sort of history, and he discusses how the right has basically accepted Lincoln as one of their own now, and it's like different from when we were younger about those criticisms. I mean, I think you even see it with, I think it might have been Dinesh D'Souza or someone like that, who's like, Lincoln was a Republican.
Yeah. He's huge on, that's his whole shtick these days, is that, like, did you know that the Democrats were the ones who support secession? And so, party of Lincoln.
That's a surrender. That's a surrender to 30 years ago. That wasn't what people were saying on the right, particularly on the far right. It was anti-Lincoln. That's a change.
Well, let's note that strangely, so there's something called the 2021 advisory team for this project, which is 4 people: Douglas Brinkley, Edna Green Medford, Richard Norton Smith, and Amity Schlaze. Is that how you say her name? So that last woman, she famously is the proponent of the greatness of Calvin Coolidge, and that's her title here, is the chairman of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. And then if you look at the ranking of Coolidge, he's in there at 24. He's moved up slightly from 26. So
what do they say? Where you stand is where you sit. And she sits in the Coolidge in the Coolidge Presidential Commission or whatever that was.
Yeah. So there's some rich people out there who really love Calvin Coolidge and like a bankroll this woman's career of writing good things about Calvin Coolidge and spreading the gospel of Calvin Coolidge.
It's a living, right? What the Flintstones would say.
Right. And especially because, the one who said that was like the toucan who was a garbage disposal.
The washing machine. Yeah.
So you can imagine what they're feeding Amity Schlaze, and this is what she's putting out. But it is so there's at least one conservative crank type on here. I don't know who Richard Norton Smith or Edna Green Medford are. Douglas Brinkley is a very prominent public, pop
right, but I would imagine even the conservatives, the conservative historians, they're not likely to be Trump historians. They're more likely to be like American greatness, patriotism, nationalist historians, which is related to the Trump thing, but isn't quite the same thing. The valence is different. So I would be shocked if there's like a Trumper on here,
there's probably
maybe one or two.
Yeah, in the list of the 100 or so, like I said, there's a huge list here. It seems like it's probably more than 100 people they consulted. I assume there's some people who are, view the Trumpist strain in American history, dating back to Jackson.
Was Trump below Bush? I forget. Was Trump worse than Bush?
Yes. Okay, so let's get into
That's ridiculous.
The bottom of the list. Okay, so we've talked about the greats, and the problems with that, and then let's talk about the basement dwellers. So here's the bottom 5 in reverse order. James Buchanan is the worst, then going Andrew Johnson, Franklin Pierce, Donald J. Trump, and William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison, of course, died in 30 days, so it's really hard to say much about what he did, and I don't know how they got, 6.4 for his sort of rankings. That's absurd. So there is the 2 presidents before the Civil War, and Andrew Johnson, the president who took over after Lincoln's assassination,
failed Reconstruction. And one of the great counterfactuals, if it wasn't Johnson in there, what Reconstruction would have been like. Yeah. I mean, that's ridiculous when you're comparing Trump to George W. Bush. I mean, that is genuinely almost offensive to the millions of people who died and were deracinated as a direct result of George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq and to begin and prosecute a war on terror. I mean, there is just no comparison.
Okay, well, I have some bad news for you.
I just want to underline that I am not a fan of Trump at all. He was also a terrible president, but in terms of consequences, George W. Bush, Trump does not approach George W. Bush. It just does not.
Well, unfortunately, your opinion is not ascendant within this group because, so they didn't rank him in 2000. In 2009, they ranked him 36th. 2017, 33. 2021, 29. So he's improving about 4 slots, every presidential administration. So he'll be in the top 20, probably when we're getting ready for retirement age, if we ever can retire as,
No, we won't. As we die at our jobs.
Penniless, insecurely employed millennials are not employed at all in my case. But yeah, so I mean, in a way, the awfulness of Trump in the common understanding is making Bush look not quite so bad in retrospect. And there's this whole thing about how he is friends with Michelle Obama and they pass each other gum or something, during H.W. Bush's funeral, this kind of nonsense. So the presentism, is sort of cutting both ways here. Everyone who's weighing in on this was alive and probably a tenured professor during the George W. Bush administration. But they're sort of saying, hey, maybe, he didn't, he actually did care about pandemics and assembled this document that was supposed to guide.
I wish he cared about Iraqi life as much as he cared about
pandemics. And he didn't, unleash his followers to storm the Capitol. So so we're sort of defining deviancy down. But yeah, well, okay. How do you think? So George W. Bush has climbed in estimation since the end of his presidency. Do you think Trump is going to climb in estimation at all, or sink, or stay down there in that bottom five?
I think that Trump will remain very, very low for however long these polls are conducted. Quite this low, probably not. I would be shocked if he ever got above 40. I mean, he was not a good president by any stretch of the imagination. He didn't unleash world-ending horror that George W. Bush did. I think Sam Moyn had a good quote in his forthcoming book, Humane. It's like Trump's foreign policies were just the policies of the previous two administrations, only more so. So he's not as consequential in that sense. He was more of a caretaker president. If there are documents, I think we'll see a lot of dithering at the top of the administration and a lot of decisions made by middle management. Which has happened before in the Reagan administration, for example, even to some degree in the Truman administration, for example. And I just think as the sort of horror that liberal establishmentarians had at Trump's grotesquerie fades, he won't be quite as low. I think once millennials become the majority of this poll, which will happen, in the next 15, 20, or 40 years, depending on how long the boomers,
they're hanging on.
They're hanging on.
Yeah, I don't know if emeritus professors are allowed to participate in the survey or not.
Oh, I'm sure they are. And Bush will sink like a stone. Leading up to the financial crisis and inaugurating the war on terror and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq are truly world historical crimes that rank him. He should be bottom five. He should be in the bottom five. He should be in the as bad as pre-Civil War presidencies. Up there. Not to compare slavery or what W did. I am not going to address that issue just in terms of his pure consequences for the world that George W. Bush unleashed were horrible, were brutal, and were terribly destructive to millions upon millions upon millions of people. Not even thinking about the financial crisis, not even thinking about his response to Katrina. So just terrible, terrible president.
Yeah, I agree. He is very bad. As someone who is not a historian and I don't know what I'm talking about, he deserves to be much lower. I mean, he is currently he's one slot behind Ford, and then two slots behind James A. Garfield. I don't know anything about his presidency, and then three slots behind Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is currently 26 in this ranking. So I guess, that's roughly in the middle, maybe just slightly below the middle. Who is the replacement level president is an interesting thing to think about. Of course, there's all these no names sort of after the Civil War, all the bearded guys who I can't distinguish them. And, it was like Era of Good Feelings and the Gilded Age and all that stuff. But anyway.
Great feeling. Great for everyone.
Let's
insane. That's like a thing. The Era of Good. Ridiculous. Like in the Jim Crow South, and the pestilential tenements of the North, and sort of the conquest of the final conquest of the West, the genocidal expansion West. So ridiculous. This is real. It's ridiculous.
Okay, yeah. So if there's, are there 46 or 45 presidents in this ring? I guess there's. Okay,
well,
they say
Biden wouldn't be ranked, right?
Right.
So
William Howard Taft is number 23, so he's smack in the middle.
Yeah, great colonial administrator of the Philippines. Awesome guy.
And yeah, so clearly your emphasis on foreign policy is much different than the average person who was responding to the survey.
So this is interesting. This is interesting because I think this is, if you're going to judge greatness, right, you have to judge it from a humanist perspective. So you have to judge about how humans because humans in philosophically are all equally, subject to have the same rights, blah, 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 if you want to think about it as a transhumanist perspective. So you have to take foreign policy into account. Unfortunately, Americans just don't care about foreign policy. So these, from any, as objective perspective is, behind a Rawlsian veil of ignorance, if you didn't know where in the world you were going to be under these presidents, I think you have to take foreign policy into account. And clearly this is just not done in these polls for most people.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I assume almost all the people ranking these are actually Americans and not, people who are from other countries but study American history. So there's that bias within it. And yeah, so I just want to, this is sort of a pseudo event that's not even an event. Like the release of this thing occasioned, write-ups in the mainstream press, and Washington Post said, talking about Trump in particular, quote, Trump got his best average rating on public persuasion, in which he came in 32nd. On moral authority and administrative skills, however, he came in dead last.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think definitely in terms of like administrative skills, Trump is pretty bad. It was sort of
that's my inclination, but we have no idea. There's no documents. This is all based on nothing, on Bob Woodward books. That's my sense.
Yeah,
sure.
The thing is, there's the famous thing where Trump, when he gets a document and he's done with it, he rips it up, and then there was like dozens of people who were being assigned to like tape these documents back together for crazy. Presidential record keeping and so forth. But he's a very strange person, and the question is, are we gonna? There aren't going to be a lot of documents coming out that paint Trump in a more positive light than what we currently understand him to be. I think there'll probably be a lot more that paint him in a negative light, or it's going to be things that weren't ever actually written down because people were like, we can't put this on paper. Like he just said something fucking insane. So it's going to be relying on, reports of the inner circle and that kind of stuff. So
and lots of emails. This is the big question for historians, people who are interested in this. Like just the pure amount of information that has been produced is going to be very difficult to go through. It's not like, even in 1970 where there were a ton of documents, but they were all hard copy for the most part. It's going to be virtually impossible to figure out what's going on with a lot of these things for historians. It's a big question.
Yeah.
Particularly, do people save things where the hard drive? This is a difficult thing.
Yeah, and then of course the the 2016 election turned in some part on the digital document retention strategy of Hillary Clinton, and just
right.
the absurdity of that whole the server in the basement kind of thing, and so the supposedly everything is being copied somewhere, but who knows if it actually could be. Of course, in the old days,
I would doubt
documents could just be destroyed.
I bet everything is not being copied. That would be my guess. Almost certainly, yeah.
But probably also a lot of these people are smart enough to realize that if there's something really bad, they should have a telephone conversation or talk about it in person with someone and not, to lay it out over email. But who knows? Okay, we've talked a lot about this. Anything else you want to say about?
Well, yeah, I want to
actually.
No, but I did want to bring up a topic that we hadn't discussed because I think we're on opposite sides of this, so it'll be interesting. So, what's your take on the January 6th riots, given the Biden administration's response in terms of like heightened, basically counter-terrorism anti-domestic extremist stuff. Because when it first happened, I got a lot of shade. I wrote 2 articles for Jacobin, one with my good friend Amber Lee Frost, and one with my good friend
that's the last time you were on. We talked about that one.
I believe we did. Yeah. So I just wanted to think and I predicted. I don't like patting myself on the back, but literally exactly what I predicted happened, and maybe even a little bit worse. With the lumping of people who are, I forget the exact phrasing, but something like anarchists and people who are like anti-capitalist into a DVE, domestic violence extremist category, at least partially. I mean, how this will be interpreted in courts or by actual agencies is of course difficult to know, but I think it's pretty frightening stuff. And particularly when you compare the power held by the administrative national security state versus the January 6 rioters. But yeah, I was just curious your take on it. Because my take has been pretty consistent, and I was just wondering if you've changed over time.
Well, the latest thing to come down is that supposedly reportedly the Capitol Police Department or whatever is going to have like established satellite branches in other places, so we can keep an eye on.
That's great. Yeah,
keep an eye on on troublemakers. I mean, okay, so the thing is, I can continue to view the events of January 6th as like deeply stupid. Is sort of the core of them, and so if they had just, what is the point of like this giant intelligent apparatus that has been built? Well, the sensible point is to prevent something like this from happening. If they had just had, 3 or 4 times as many like armed cops in riot gear to begin with, instead of just uniformed officers. And, did you watch that thing, the New York Times documentary they put together about the unfolding of the charging into the building itself? It's a fascinating document, and they used a lot of the original footage that the people themselves were filming, the live streamers and so forth. And, they show like the exact moment when one person who seems to be involved with the Proud Boys goes up, turns his cap around backwards, and starts getting in the face of one of these cops who's just, standing behind the barricade. And he starts shit with this guy and riles everyone else in the crowd up. And that's the first breaking point. And once that happened, the deluge came. So if they just had more police officers there, then it would have been a lot harder for these people to get in.
Sure, but now we're talking about the micro event of like the specific.
Okay, okay. I think
so. That is not that interesting to
me.
You and I can
agree that like I think that the Capitol should be defended enough that rabble rousers and other like disreputable types can't storm in and like take over and start smashing windows. Like, would you agree with that from your Ivy League perch over there in not Ivy League?
I wish I was Ivy League.
Your ivory tower.
Then I'd be making a lot more money. Sure. Yes.
So there should be like enough.
You shouldn't be allowed to storm and try to attack members of Congress.
Okay, so our giant, Homeland Security apparatus and NSA reading people's emails and something like didn't prepare us enough to repel the rabble and the confused people and so forth who managed to do this ridiculous thing.
That is not a correct thing to draw. It is not. These are all choices that people make. So what it shows is that you could still have this incredibly frightening apparatus, and it doesn't matter if certain people who are responsible for particular things don't do certain things. That's what it shows. It doesn't show that we need more. We have quite a bit.
Whatever system we had failed. So we should.
Right. But I would say the failure is not in the technology of the system. First of all, failure according to its own terms. I would say the whole system is a failure because you don't want our civil liberties to be basically just disregarded. But that's a different issue.
If you set up a system to prevent a mob from storming a building, and then they storm the building, then that's a systemic failure. So it's unclear, and there should be a lot of people looking into what the security apparatus knew about what was going to happen and why they reacted so poorly to it, and that will probably be a contested thing for a long time to come. The Republicans don't want that sort of investigation to happen, and I think it is possible that there were people sort of on the inside who were like sympathetic to the what became the mob, and then there's biases of thinking, oh, these are sort of our type of people, these are just white people from Ohio, and they like are just wearing silly costumes, and so it's not like those Antifa, BLM anarchist types, and so they're not really dangerous. That kind of stuff came into play. So in some respect, like, something needs to change, and because there was this huge failure that was totally absurd, and it could have been a lot worse. Thankfully, the mob didn't get to tear anyone limb from limb or anything like that. I think they probably would have done something like that, honestly, if they had been able to encounter actual, or at least done something, try to beat them up or something, beat up the Congress people, beat up Mike Pence, or who knows what, or maybe just take a selfie photo with them. They're just this total aspect of absurdity and stupidity to the entire event. So I'm not like a resistance lib who's thinking that, this blah blah blah.
But even beyond the events itself, right? I think framing it in this way and having what could only, I think, accurately to be described as a literally hysterical reaction to something that just, and pure power facts was not a threat to the Republic. Presenting it in any way as a threat to the Republic, I think it gives intellectual and institutional succor to people who want to do things like increase the power of the national security state.
Well,
and when one is doing let me just finish. When one is doing a pure objective power analysis, there is just no connection between literally the military national security state versus a bunch of ramshackle, even if violent, and I think that it's clear that some of them were violent and some of them did have bad intentions, rioters that were able to enter the Capitol. I just think that power analysis is just not accurate. There's
no way that an outside force can take down the American government in any reality that I understand. Like the threat to the American government was Donald Trump and his GOP, but they're within the system, not outside the system. So
they're not a threat to the government. You can't say an elected president is a threat to the government. That just doesn't make sense unless you have.
He was the elected president, but he lost the election, and then he claimed he didn't lose the election, and it was being stolen from him, and that was sort of the crux of the whole.
Oh, you're talking about post. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I thought you were talking about while he was president.
Well, if Trump had declared himself,
that was definitely against norms that I would support. Yeah.
If Trump had declared himself first field marshal or something, someone would have, put him in jail or something, or the military would have come in and taken him away, or maybe some Secret Service agent would have just shot him in the head and ended the entire thing. I'm actually somewhat surprised that something like that didn't happen. But so yeah, there's no, and like in the same way that 9/11 killing 3,000 people and bringing down skyscrapers and destroying 1/5 of the Pentagon didn't do anything to bring down the American system. It's all what we do ourselves. And so obviously the people who are storming the Capitol are part of ourselves and Americans, but so the proper response would have been, this is really, it was a scary event, particularly for people who experienced it. There's just no way to deny that, but it wasn't a meaningful threat to the Republic. And given recent history, the last 20 years of actually existing history, we need to be very wary about increasing the power of the security state. That is the proper anti-Trump response to that. Except there was a drama that people are playing out in their lives to make it seem like they're in the French Resistance in 1943, 1944. I agree with that, and that's the cosplay aspect.
Makes it there's a cosplay aspect to it. This is not to. I don't think that's in any way, shape, or form downplaying what were obviously scary events. Again, for people who, particularly for people who were literally there. But that was not what happened in the result. It was treated as literally, I don't know, the British burning of the White House during the War of 1812. That was absurd.
Well,
is going to have bad consequences for people, particularly critics on the left.
There's the facts, and then there's the myth or the symbolism of it. And so the symbolism of QAnon shaman in his horns standing in the well of the Senate or wherever he was, that's a symbolic image that we're not going to forget anytime soon. And so the rabble they could have killed they could have killed a congressman. Like that could have conceivably happened. They wouldn't have actually derailed the eventual counting of the electoral ballots or affected in any way the fact that Joe Biden was going to become president. So it makes sense that the people who are members of Congress and who the Capitol Police are protecting are very angry about this huge failure.
As they should be.
Yes,
as they should be. Yes,
there has not been a passage of a new Homeland Security law there has not been a.
You don't need passages of laws. This is the whole thing.
But there hasn't been a Patriot Act 2.0.
Right, but this is an administrative state. This is a bureaucratic state. It's all interpretation of rules. This is one of the reasons the American state is so anti-democratic. You don't actually need the passage of laws to do horrible things. Mm-hmm. Right? It's all interpretation of rules. I mean, look at the lawyers in the Bush and Obama administrations, justifying basically whatever they wanted to justify. So I think that looking for a criterion to the passage of law is just not an accurate reflection about how power actually works in this system.
Well, I guess we'll have to see how this actually plays out. Okay, so you're right. The powers that the state has are already pretty expansive, and it's just how they apply it and whether courts push back or not. So we'll have to see how.
Not even courts, not necessarily. I mean, you could have totally internal White House decision making on interpretation of rules.
Right, but there would be, if someone had a tort against them or whatever, they would sue because we live in a very legalistic country. But what? So let's say that. Ron DeSantis becomes president, and then there's another sort of uprising in some blue state city, like has been happening in, Portland or something. And then we'd have to see what would happen if President DeSantis did what Tom Cotton wanted Trump to do, and did send in the military and really did start cracking heads or opening fire on crowds of protesters who are nonviolent or violent, and then we'd have to see what would happen. I mean, it's mostly norms that prevent that sort of thing from happening. And who got in trouble for for Kent State? I have no idea. Did anyone get fired because of Kent State? It was just sort of national revulsion that made that an iconic.
I actually don't know the micro details of that. But my guess is probably not, just knowing the Nixon administration.
Right.
But I actually don't know. This is not an area of expertise.
So I think we will have to see how this plays out. There hasn't, Biden has not announced the democracy force or something a new, and people should be turning in their neighbors kind of thing as what's happening in Russia.
Well, there was something like that, right? There was something. I don't remember exactly, so maybe I'm not incorrect, but I thought there was something along the lines of, maybe it wasn't the administration, but there were calls for people to be aware of what their neighbors and their family members are doing, I believe. And
right, and
on that. Okay,
and so there were plenty of people in America who knew that their loved ones or friends were getting very into this thing called QAnon, over the past couple of years, and probably some of them were didn't pay attention to it, and some of them were this is weird, I don't want to talk to you anymore, and maybe other ones are you're saying crazy things about Tom Hanks being a pedophile or a clone, and so I'm trying to disabuse you of these notions. And so after January 6th, probably people will take that more seriously if they know someone who seems to be going into this weird radicalization fantasy land and that kind of thing. And maybe those people will be more likely to call the police if they their
But
son,
is that the solution? I mean, this is the problem, right?
If their son is starts assembling
if you start assembling weapons, sure.
Well,
yeah, but
it's very easy to assemble weapons in America because you can get a gun.
Right. And that's not illegal. So yeah. And so this is a big problem.
So probably these things will be, I mean, these aren't good developments, but probably these things will be more people, mothers will be calling 911 because they think their son, is hasn't left his room in 72 hours and is very angry about critical race theory or something like that. But yeah, I don't think there's not, we're not moving to East Germany.
I guess just
territory.
To wrap up this part of the conversation, it just seems hard to me to see what positive benefits will come out of treating the riots of January 6th as something more structurally terrifying than they actually were.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, I have come to sort of the pessimistic point of view that almost any new development in American life ultimately has more negative consequences than positive ones. It's 25 years ago, it's we have this way to get into chat rooms and I can sit in my house and talk to strangers and stuff. That's fun. And then it mostly results in more human misery than human flourishing. And so
I'm not sure I agree with you there, but that's another conversation.
Okay,
I think that's that's the easy criticism of the internet. I don't think it's accurate. I think that sort of misery is a function of not of the technology, but of the material conditions.
It's technology and capitalism. I'm not a socialist,
Yeah,
but you
which is the big one there.
Yeah,
is it the internet or the entire structure of society?
It's both. So yeah, okay. Well, let's leave that one there. Okay, let's talk about something a little more lighthearted, and that is an article that you co-wrote that Randon Jacobin will include the link on Pluggy Heads. Slimer on Coke, Muncher on Zoloft is the headline. And it's really one of my favorite things that I've read over the past year or so. And so it's you, Matt, Chrisman, and Amber, right? Previously mentioned Amber Frost.
Amber Lee Frost, yeah.
So they're both Trap House hosts, and you looked at Ghostbusters, the original 1985 Ghostbusters, but also the news peg is that there's a new version of Ghostbusters. Maybe I guess it was supposed to come out last year, but delayed till this year. And they released a promotional image of one of the ghosts who's named Muncher. And so this is sort of like the updated version of Slimer, except Muncher is maybe not quite so happy, joyful, extravagant as Slimer, the character we all grew up, us older geriatric millennials grew up loving in the late 80s and early 90s. And yeah, I encourage everyone to read this piece. I think it's really funny and well done. But please tell us a little bit more about where this came from.
Sure. So we were friends. We were chatting, Matt, Amber, and I, and we were just kind of riffing on the funniness of comparing Slimer, who, if people remember from the original Ghostbusters, is this green blobbish ghost, but kind of has like a joie de vivre. He's constantly consuming, he's having fun, he's silly, he's running around. He probably most importantly for people of my and Aria's age was the mascot of the Ghostbusters cartoon, The Real Ghostbusters, where he was essentially a childlike figure and was funny and curious and sweet. And so he just had a zest for living, a zest for life. And then you compare the Slimer to at least obviously, of course, the movie hasn't come out, so there's projection, but to this blobbish blue ghost who is like I think the line we had, who's in a rictus grin, clinging on to a kind of like an oil derrick type thing, or like a water tower type thing in front of a field of corn. And we were just like, it's kind of funny that like this sluggish type figure is like put in front of this field of corn, and obviously everyone knows with the corn subsidies and that there's corn syrup and everything, and so much of our food is processed corn, and it's literally killing a lot of Americans, probably linked to things like cancer increases. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but that's my understanding. I apologize if I'm wrong. And a general sort of like sluggishness to American life. And it was interesting to see how in Ghostbusters was released in '84. This new one will be released in 2021. How in the 37 years, the big difference between the belief in America that defined, I would say, a shadow belief or a belief that didn't really make sense, Reagan era America, with what's going on today, where really no one believes in the system and everyone is really depressed. And so we made arguments about how the first one took place in New York City and this new one takes place in the Midwest. People are leaving the city because it's just too expensive to live. They've got to return, a remigration back to the rural area and feeding themselves on corn. They're all depressed and sluggish, as opposed to the heightened experiences of Reagan's era 80s New York.
Yeah, so I encourage everyone to read the piece, and then you also did a conversation on the podcast Low Culture Boil, where you talked about this also, which was enjoyable. And
everyone listen to Low Culture Boil. It's a really good podcast that basically takes like an academic critical look to like things that are quote unquote low culture. Check that podcast out. And so the framing of this piece of Ghostbusters being sort of a paradigmatic 80s Reagan era movie really made a ton of sense to me. And it's, Ghostbusters is probably one of the movies I've seen the most in my life, because it was just one of those ones we had on VHS when I was a kid, and it would be on TV all the time, and you could just drop in at any point, and it was just fun and silly. And it also is one of those movies that became a kids movie, but sort of like is an adult movie in a lot of ways. And like there's a part where a ghost
gives a blowjob to Dan Aykroyd's character, which is the kind of thing a child wouldn't understand, or maybe the parent would fast forward past that little moment.
It's not a kid's movie. It's not a kid's movie.
Right, but then it turned into
an adult movie
because of the merchandising. The merchandising of the '80s made it, and the fact that they did this cartoon version of it that was like explicitly for children, made it this iconic thing for kids. And I'm actually, I'm just briefly show. I'm wearing my '80s toy shirt right now, and you can see there's Egon. We have Optimus Prime in the middle, He-Man, Batman, Voltron, Smurf, and there's Egon with his proton pack and so forth. And you can see how sweaty I get when I keep these things. Sorry, everyone, but yeah. And so thinking about how Ghostbusters embodies the values of Reagan's '80s made a ton of sense to me. And you guys were sort of joking on the square, but the villain in the movie. But aside from like Gozer, the real villain is an EPA bureaucrat who shuts down the containment unit and thus releases all these stored ghoulies and ghosts and causes havoc. The main characters are academics who are sort of like, some of them at least are like explicit frauds, and they're ensconced within Columbia University, and they don't want to, and they get kicked out, and then they have to go in the private sector. And there's a line you highlight where I think Ray says, I've been in the private sector. They expect results. And so our heroes are sort of like, ex-academics who become small business owners by creating the Ghostbusters. And they're sort of privatizing what could be considered a public, the kind of thing that like a public agency should deal with, because ghosts are sort of a, particular, but also a common problem. And so the Ghostbusters are somewhere between like the police, the firefighters, and like plumbers or something, and they're wearing these.
Yeah, they're dressed like plumbers. Yeah, I think the idea was that they'd be exterminators in the script. They're dressed like exterminators, kind of.
Yeah, they're these jumpsuits, and so so if they're exterminators, there's no. You hire a private exterminator. Generally, governments don't employ their own exterminators, and they're busting ghosts certainly. And then the part of the movie is the Ghostbusters get thrown in jail, and then the mayor. At one point has to demand, get me the Ghostbusters, because it's like only these people in the private sector can rescue the city from all the ghosts and ghoulies that are happening. So I think there really is a lot there.
Well, it's a baby boomer shift to basically neoliberalism, right? These are countercultural figures who essentially have a very conservative understanding of politics as expressed in the script, which is basically the story of the baby boom generation, the decline of radicalism and the embrace of neoliberal capitalism. And I think you see it through this. And I think all those guys are like, I think they were like 33. So they're like exactly in the perfect baby boomers. And I think the film, which is a great film. Yeah. One of my probably top 5 of all time. Does reflect, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And that was a conservative, anti-government, small human farmer / small business owner, which is what that transformed into, a vision of politics. And I think the vision of politics, at least expressed through the Munchers, still is going to, of the 2021 Ghostbusters, is going to be very depressing. It's going to be, it's very nostalgic. It's IP. It's not original. I think it has to do with Egon's family. Egon's dead, so it's a return to the glory days. So whatever you guys think.
Yeah, so you riffed a lot on this one image, and riffed in a way that Matt Christman is just very good at riffing. We'll have to see what happens when the movie actually comes out. They did release sort of a teaser trailer scene, where you see the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man like coming back to life as like these little ghouly sort of thing that's like starts attacking Paul Rudd. So they're playing on the nostalgia and our warm feelings for the original one and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man and all that stuff, and they're rebooting it, and so that's a classic thing that's been happening for the past 20 years in Hollywood. But it also the director is the guy who the original director's son, right?
It's is it Ivan Reitman? Is that who directed it? I believe
Ivan Reitman played Egon, just as Jason Reitman is.
No, Harold Ramis.
Oh no, Harold Ramis. Oh no,
yeah,
okay.
Ivan Reitman is a director, and his son, Jason.
Jason. Okay, Jason I was conflating these two people, but so. This whole, we don't need to get into this whole thing, but this whole thing of old intellectual property being rebooted, and then they change some things, and then people are mad, and it just
by the literal children who made the first one. If that doesn't reflect our society, I don't know what does.
Yeah, there's this whole, you murdered my childhood, you destroyed my childhood thing because, now like She-Ra is bisexual or whatever it is.
Those sorts of arguments are just so sad that like adults care about these children's entertainments. That's so grim to me that people like literally get these angry responses. I think probably mostly men is my understanding. It's just so grim. Well, that's what you have to be worried about. That's what you have to be angry about.
Yeah. So there's a real sort of like decadence decline sort of thing because like we can't come up with any new ideas. We're just rehashing the old stuff over and over again. Another Star Wars, another Star Trek, another He-Man, another Transformers. At the same time, like, okay, I don't get super mad about these things. I could imagine some like parallel version of myself getting super mad about them though, because like, the things that you loved as a child, you come to sentimentalize them and view them in a certain way. And then when you confront them again as an adult, you see things differently. But, if I were to go back, so the thing I was really into as a kid was Transformers. If I were to go back and watch the original Transformer cartoons, I feel like this is boring. Like the animation is so bad, it's so cheesy and everything. But then when it like comes back as this huge Hollywood multi-million-dollar special effects extravaganza and sucks, then it somehow seems even worse than just like realizing the things you were doing as a kid were products for children and not really all that good. Generally, some of them were good. Most of them were average or crap. You can see how it does make people angry in a way that like, I don't know, it's sort of like a Freudian thing about like realizing your parents are perfect beings or something like that. But then it's worse because it'd be like if your parents, wrote a novel about your childhood in which you were the villain or something along those lines. Like it strikes at something within us. So I understand in some respects that the people get super angry about it. Well,
I mean, it's basically a general thing I think we see in our politics that we don't think there's a future really, right? So the only joy can be had in past experience, right? Nostalgia is not a sign of a healthy culture. It's a sign of not a unhealthy culture. I'm not going to say necessarily decrepit or in decline because I don't think culture works in that sort of like cyclical way, but it's just not a sign of a vibrant space.
I agree with that.
To be lost in nostalgia. Yeah.
For sure. And, the winning slogan in 2016 was Make America Great Again. And so that was a very nostalgic idea. And it was, in my opinion, we were nostalgic for the 1950s sitcom America. It wasn't even nostalgia for reality. It was a nostalgia for entertainment. It had a mythic vision of what a mid-century America. And speaking of mythic visions, how's that for a
that's good, man.
This is segue.
That's a good segue.
The final topic we want to cover is, one that a lot of people are talking about these days. More and more, you're hearing people talk about this critical race theory and sort of this whole bizarre cultural, nonsense about it. And the part about, how we understand America and how we understand the myths that sustain that vision ties into this a lot. And there was an essay, I didn't bring this up before, but did you see John Ganz's Substack essay about this from a couple weeks ago?
What did John say?
So it headline, we'll link to it. 1619 Project Revisited the Anglo-Saxon Roots of Critical Race Theory. It's a very interesting piece, and it made me sort of understand. So, people have been since the 1619 Project thing came out, this has been making people angry, including people on the Blog AS platform. And I didn't get it. I didn't get both why people love this so much or why people are so angry about it. I was thinking like
about critical race theory.
Well, 1619 is connected to critical race theory in sort of the way the whole blob has like formed. So there's like 1619 critical race theory, anti-racism of the Kendi sort, white fragility. Right. This is all sort of
my understanding. So like I have been an observer of this, and I'm not a specialist in early America, so I am not taking a stand just because I haven't read the essays. So just putting that out on the table, but I have read the debates around them. My understanding is that the criticism of the 1619 Project from the right is something along the lines of that slavery is presented as an original sin, and it's not patriotic, and it's not and it's not, unovercomable. And my understanding is that criticism from the left is that slavery and the enslavement of Africans is also presented as an original sin, which makes it appear that it's like a permanent stain and that change is impossible. That's my understanding of the general debate over 1619. So the left and the right, from what I understand, both focus on this notion of original sin, but take different implications from it. As sort of, so the left, if my understanding is correct, basically it says that the project presents it as like, that's it, this is what it is. We'll never be able to overcome racism in this country because it's embedded into it, and that is a pessimistic, cynical view, is my understanding, is the left critique, and the right critique is what one could imagine as sort of like a nationalist, and implicit elements among some of them, at least, of white supremacist approach to American history. So that's my understanding of the debate. With critical race theory, I actually first came across critical race theory about 9 or 10 years ago as a legal theory. My understanding, it was, and still is for that matter, primarily confined to law schools, and it's a particular approach to understanding how law functioned over time, which is essentially that like structural conditions of race and racism shape legal outcomes, which to me seems pretty irrefutable. To me,
the way people are talking about it now seems seems largely disconnected from what the original thing is. And so we can just say, people 18 months ago were talking about wokeness or Black Lives Matter,
cultural
and now they're
Marxism,
about,
or 20 years ago, political correctness, right? So it's the latest cultural fixation of the right, basically. I mean,
so in a way, using this term and debating whether the term applies is, part of it, but also like people are mad about something and they're not mad about, legal theorizing from 30 years ago. Like they're mad about something that is happening or they perceive as happening now. And it's not, a esoteric understanding of the American legal tradition. It's
not even that esoteric. This is what there's a lot of critique. It's not that esoteric. Saying that racial structures inform legal outcomes to me is like pretty basic.
Okay, maybe
like
esoteric,
a pretty insightful.
Esoteric isn't the right word, but like it's sort of like one way of understanding the law that is not the mainstream way of understanding it. And it's like cultural Marxism or something. So anyway, something is happening, and I'll just read this line from Conor Friedrichsdorf's piece about this. The populist right is using.
Can I just say one thing? Just very quickly about Conor.
Well, let me go off on Conor.
No, I'm not going to go off on Conor, but I just find it annoying. And Conor, not personally, I won't go off on him, but this general thing that I see, which is like a criticism of American universities paying absolutely no attention to what's actually happening to professors, which is that they're being hollowed out, which is that 78% of people are teaching on adjunct contracts, which makes it impossible to actually give good education to children. So if anyone actually cared about education, instead of basically culture war talking points, they would point to the structural inequalities of academia. So I just find it very frustrating that this is what the focus is, as opposed to what the labor conditions of so many people who are suffering as adjunct professors. And to me, this whole thing basically misses the point. And it's just a shame that someone like Conor, with this national platform, focuses on what is essentially not the main story of what's happening in universities.
Well, the thing that people are mad about now, and it probably will not be the thing they're mad about 6 months from now, is not about colleges. It's about K-12, and it's these laws that state legislatures are passing.
But Conor has done a lot of cancel culture stuff, and
I agree with that.
It is not separate. It is part of the same discursive space.
So I'm reading a line, and then I will point out something that I disagree with it, and then you can tear it apart as well. This is from Conor's piece. We'll link to it. The populist right is now using critical race theory, a term that originally referred to a distinct decades-old form of scholarship about racism in American politics and law, to encompass everything conservatives dislike about leftist identity politics, while the progressive left now understands CRT to be mere common sense truths about racism in America. Okay, so I think the word leftist is incorrect there. This is not a leftist thing. But aside from that,
no,
it sort of does make sense. Something is happening. People are talking about new things that they weren't talking about 10 years ago. And it's not about Kimberly Crenshaw. It's about, are white people inherently good or bad? What happens if the teacher tells little Timmy that, his ancestors did bad things to black people? it's more stuff like that. So it gets more into the mythic part, and this is what Gans's piece really clarified for me. Is
what did John say?
Okay, he relates it back to this what he calls the Anglo-Saxon roots of critical race theory, which is this idea that going back to like the 1600s and 1700s in England about whether basically, whether the Norman conquest sort of like ripped every like the common law understanding of the Anglo-Saxons like up together, or sort of like whether that was a legitimate political act. He explains it much better than I'm able to. I encourage people to read this piece. But basically, there were people back then who were saying, the Normans really fucked up this great Anglo-Saxon thing we had. And there's nothing...
Wait, is John referring to actual documents, or is this like a thought experiment?
No, this is things that actually people were debating, in the 1700s.
In the Anglo... Oh, people were... The 1700s were debating 1066.
Yes.
That's what's going on here.
Yes.
Okay, so a mythic understanding.
There were people back then who were saying, there was nothing like legitimate about the Norman conquest. Like, this is just because they won. I'm probably getting some facts of this wrong. They won the battles, but that doesn't mean that like what they did had like divine providence behind it or was right.
Right.
And so there are things within the Anglo
theodicy problem. Yeah.
There are things within the Anglo-Saxon tradition that were usurped by the Norman conquest, and so it's sort of like the entire, this is getting into like the English Civil War and whether there should be a king or not, and and it's about myths. It's not about really the truth. It's about the myth of the divine right of kings kind of thing back then. But today, the myth is America a good country, and that's what children.
Right, it's a theodicy problem
for a long time.
Well, it's literally
America's a good country.
What is God good? And if God is good, how can He allow evil in the world? Right,
well,
and
we can't talk about that in public schools. So that sort of stuff.
Well, I mean,
as
mainline Protestantism has the. No, well, I would say, and I agree with David Hollinger, the great historian at Berkeley, on this, as mainline Protestantism went into decline, it basically became secular liberalism after World War II. So a lot of these theological problems have been secularized, even though they have their valence. Again, Matt Karp talks about this in his piece, and I think it very insightfully. So there is a theological element to it. It's just submerged. And which is why I think you get notions like original sin prevailing. There is an element of original sin. I don't think that's an incorrect interpretation. Again, I haven't read it, but that's my understanding. Enough people I respect have said that. So there is a theological element to a lot of these things, but that then they get put on on sort of a secularized discourse.
Yeah. So we're the sort of like the surface level is these debates, and people mad at Ibram Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and this kind of stuff, but then I'm getting into like Jordan Peterson territory now. Like, really, what's happening beneath are these sort of like mythic like ideas about like good and evil, sin and forgiveness.
Yeah, that's not Jordan Peterson.
Well, I mean, we're more. Are we Freudian? Are we Jungian? I don't know. But it really is like. Is a lot of it is what you were taught as a child about America, and you came to believe and not think about a lot, but just sort of inherently believe about this being a good country committed to the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Like, was that a lie? Like, were you told a lie as a child and kept on believing that? And then are these liberal teachers going to tell your grandchildren?
So to me, this is like ultimately an empirical question. Right, like take your normative values as expressed in whatever document, and it's interesting that you have a document, serving in place of the Bible, right, where it occupies a semi-mythic status.
The document, let's say the Constitution?
The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, I mean, whatever people refer to, I think it differs. Do the normative ideals as expressed in those documents reflect what happened in American history? And I think people... if they took an honest look at it, would answer that question in a particular way. Now, there's also the other question. I think this is what like Glenn Loury would say, and obviously Glenn's someone I respect. I spend a lot of time speaking with him. He would say that like it never lived up to its ideals, but that doesn't mean that its ideals are like literally capital T true. And that might be the case. That's mostly a philosophical problem. And then the question is how do we reach those ideals? And I think that's what that's what someone like Glenn would say to one of the critics of the 1619 Project from the right.
I think like I'm not, there's this idea of like the noble lie, and I don't fully understand this, but it's sort of like, I think this is one of the things that gets Glenn angry about it. It's sort of like, if we teach our children that this country was horrible to begin with, then like, what's the point of trying to, try and like do the things that will get you to succeed in American life, like going to school and like working a job.
I mean, ultimately,
if this whole thing was like fucked up and was exploiting black people and like a crock of shit to begin with.
Right.
So like, we need to tell the commoners that there's this like higher thing going on, and that it's not like, poisoned. Like there was this poison branch or poison seed or something at the very beginning, and so the entire thing is rotten, evil, and horrible.
Right, which is which is not an absurd argument. I think people have to take that argument seriously, and what that might mean. I mean, I think I reject the paternalist politics inherent in that, because I just think that, again, empirically, experts have shown that they don't know better. They have fucked up things so badly that I'm skeptical of the inherent like pastoralism and paternalism in that argument. And I would also say that I just don't think K-12 education is having that sort of ideological effect on people. I think people are much more likely to get their understanding of American history from other sources, not the 40 minutes every 2 days they spend in history classes in seventh grade. I think. Yeah, I mean,
how many things that you were taught in middle school do you really remember? Or it's sort of. Again, it's sort of this fight about the surface and tapping on the surface.
Yeah, you get a general. I would say Saving Private Ryan was far more important to my understanding of U.S. history than anything I learned in middle school. And I'm sure that's true for many kids today with video games and movies and TV. So I think this is like education is always a space of dissent, because this is the people who make media culture. This is the world that they live in. They're all college educated. And oftentimes they all went to like the same 30 to 40 schools. So they are obsessed over education because that is their world. But I am skeptical of whether education has a sort of causal impact on ideology that these arguments suppose. I might be wrong. That's an empirical question.
I agree that both sides are sort of falling for this. That if we have a week spent on anti-racism training, this will make the students no longer racist. I don't think that's the case.
No,
or also the children, the right-wing conspiracy version of it, like the children are being indoctrinated with Marxian cultural Marxism, blah, blah, blah. Like, I mean, how many Americans do you think probably believe that like George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and then said, I cannot tell a lie about it? Probably like half or more, I would think.
Probably a fair amount, right? Because people don't like, why the hell would someone spend their time in these esoteric historical debates? I mean, there's just no sense. We have a political economy that makes people work all the time, and so they're not going to have these time. So this is, again, just a lot of these debates to me are just kind of like, I don't know, pointless is too strong, but they seem a little bit besides the point, because they're just college educated people in the media sphere arguing over shit on Twitter or in the pages of The Atlantic. And I just don't think the causal force of those arguments, or even what they're arguing over, is ultimately that influential, that impactful, that important.
Yes, that makes sense to me. And, I'm just thinking now that there's a connection between our previous topic, which is, Zack Snyder ruined my childhood because of the way he portrayed Superman. It's like, the things we were taught as children, stay with us inside ourselves, even if we reject them. And, so there's people who probably think that, Ibram Kendi is destroying their childhood if they were taught that America was good. And, we've been the positive force of the world throughout 200 years, or even that there's a divine providence, within the founding of America, so on and so forth. We're getting at myths and things that are like held deeply, and sort of arguing. You're not going to argue someone out of that. I think like you're not going to. I don't know. I don't think you take someone who thinks America is good and you're going to. There are also present an argument to them that actually America is bad. Like that's not how it works.
Again, in education, there's so many more important things happening that I really wish, not to say this isn't important. Obviously, I do think that like teaching people about the realities of American racism and the history of American racism, which is awful and it's brutal and genocidal, and terrible in every way, shape, or form is very important. But I just wish it didn't. The debates about CRT, which are really just updated debates about cultural Marxism, which are really just updated debates about political correctness, didn't suck out all of the oxygen, and people focus a little bit more on the structural conditions of labor in the university system, both at the K through 12 level and at the university level. To me, that is such an important story that just gets almost no coverage and almost no discussion in these very elite spaces.
Yeah. But one thing I do want to add in is, I've been sort of saying this whole thing is, a big ball of nonsense, but like there are things that are changing about the way people and organizations and institutions are treating these things, and that is causing some form of blowback or backlash or something. Like, and so an example of this is that I'm applying for jobs right now, and there's been a couple times where you have to fill out these forms online, and there's a required field that says like, how will you further diversity, equity,
right? And to me, inclusion. That's just and the domestication of these radical criticisms, which is again the history of the last 50 years, that corporate America domesticates radical critique to serve the ends of itself and ultimately capitalism.
Right. So Coca-Cola is not going to really do a lot in this world to further diversity, equity, inclusion. Maybe if they went out of business and stopped selling sugar water to the children of the world, that would do that. But so it's sort of like it's bullshit and phony in that respect, but like if you actually have to like fill out these applications and think about it and think about something that whoever is reading this statement is not going to mark you, like throw your resume away because of this, then you're thinking about things that maybe wouldn't have been the job applicant 10 years ago wouldn't have had to think about. And it's like, well, what is one can think
sure.
This whole thing is a sham and bullshit, and then that makes one more likely to think that white fragility and so forth are a sham and bullshit, which probably it does seem like white fragility is a sham and bullshit. I haven't read it and won't, but
that's the Robin DiAngelo book.
Yeah, that's
right?
the DiAngelo one. I don't know. I've heard plenty of people talk about this. I've never read them. Yeah, it seems like Kendi is more respectable than DiAngelo, who.
Yeah, Kendi is a trained historian.
But anyway,
he was an academic
something is
historian,
happening, and it's not total. It's not just. It in ways it is the same debate people were having in the 80s and 90s about political correctness, but like it's different in other ways, or something new is happening, and it's going to cause reactions in various ways. And the thing that's happening, it's unclear to me.
Yeah, I mean, and it isn't a bad thing to like be aware of how structures work in society. I think that's like on balance a positive development to be aware about how conditions of racism shaped various things, and being asked to reflect on that in a job application, isn't the worst thing in the world. Of course not.
Yeah. This is somewhat related. Have you ever heard of this debate about affinity groups, especially in like high schools?
No, what's that?
So I know about this. A teacher told me about this last year. And this woman is a teacher at a private school in New York City. And this school has something called affinity groups. And so it's sort of like an extracurricular thing, but you have to participate in it. It's sort of like, back in the day when like every kid had to play a sport or something. So every kid has to be part of an affinity group. And so there's a Black affinity group, there's a Hispanic affinity group, there's a gay affinity group. And because this is a religious school, there's probably some religious affinity groups, but then like there's some kids who are left over and they're like in the white affinity group. And so what's going to happen in the
white affinity group?
It's probably not called that explicitly, but like, because everyone has to be in an affinity group. If you're not, if you're not in the disabled or the gay or the Black affinity group, they stick to like everyone else is in this other thing. But then those kids are like reading White Fragility or the high school equivalent, whereas the Black affinity group is, reading Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so the Black affinity group is learning about Black stuff, and then the white affinity group is learning about how bad white people are. And this whole thing seems stupid to me. Again, I'm going off of an anecdote, but
Yeah, it's a transformation in liberalism, right? During the Cold War, it was all about the melting pot, and there are lots of historical explanations about why that was in order to build up consensus. Third generation children of immigrants, blah blah blah. And I think we're going to look back on this time and see like how liberalism transformed and embrace certain different elements, and that both reflected the time and reflected transformations in larger historical structures and things like that. I think that is definitely going to be the case, and it's difficult to see when you're in it what exactly what transformations these sorts of phenomena precisely reflect ideologically, institutionally, and materially.
Yeah, and so this is sort of getting into like the Barry Weiss like newsletter beat that she, weird things are happening at fancy New York City private schools, and the parents are unhappy. But I could imagine if I was a rich New York City parent, and then my white kid was being, was part of his day was being filled with the white affinity group and reading, white fragility excerpts or something, like I'd be like, what is, this is stupid. Or getting angry
the white
about
affinity group, that is like a frightening,
so it's not, it wouldn't be called the white affinity group. Maybe it was like the unaffiliated affinity group or something. But like, because this particular school, and maybe this is just unusual that this particular school was doing this, made it so that like, one period a week, instead of going to study hall, the kids all went to their affinity groups. They had to have the leftover group, and that was the basic white people essentially, who are probably some of them descendants of Peter Stuyvesant and so forth. But
right. In New York, yeah, especially, yeah.
That when this woman told me about this, I found it very strange, but so weird things are happening, and people are going to make
things are being worked out, as they say. Things are happening and being worked out.
Things are happening. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about your podcast that you are launching.
Sure, yeah. So it's the first episode will, I guess, when will this be released?
This will
tomorrow.
This will probably go up next week. Would be my guess.
Next week. So last Friday, July 9th, which is the day of recording, but is for you all listeners and viewers in the past, I'm launching a podcast titled American Prestige with Derek Davison, who runs really, I would say, the essential foreign policy news Substack called Foreign Exchanges. I really implore people who are interested in international affairs to subscribe to Derek's thing. Again, Foreign Exchanges, it's really the best source of just news on what's going on in the world and history and whatnot.
And he was on a couple weeks ago with Bob Wright and did an interesting episode about Iraq.
He was on with Bob Wright about Iraq, yeah. And Derek, more than anyone that I personally know, just knows the details of what's going on in so many areas of the world and so many countries. It's really impressive. So we're launching a podcast, again, called American Prestige, where I take kind of the macro historical view, and Derek takes more of the nitty-gritty, what's going on the ground, analyzing what's going on in the world, how the United States is responding, and in particular interviews with foreign affairs experts. So if people are interested in international affairs, if they want to get a quick digest of important issues, if they want to hear from some, I would think interesting people who normally aren't heard from on mainstream news sources, like actually Stephen Wartime is, but like Aziz Rana and others, I encourage you all to subscribe and give it a shot. Again, it's called American Prestige.
And how did you arrive at that title?
Well, of course, American Prestige is like a famous foreign policy community quote about how you always have to worry about like America's prestige in the world, because we always constantly have to be number one amongst everything and everyone. And so it's a bit of a winking nod to that basically meaningless, but yet totally meaningful phrase. And we've got some really cool art that will hopefully be up by the time you guys are able to listen to it. And I hope everyone could give it a shot if you think I'm interesting.
I think you're interesting. That's why I asked you to come on once again today. So thank you for doing so. And people should check that out. They can follow you on Twitter. And what is your Twitter handle?
It's just my first initial and last name, D. Bessner. And
mine is REACW. And people can rate and review this particular podcast, Culturally Determined, in Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, and that helps, the algorithm these algorithms which control our destiny, it shows it to more people, that kind of thing. And so if you could do that, that would help more people find this content, which I think would be a good thing. And so why don't we end it there? So Daniel, thank you for taking the time. Thanks to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Aria.